Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the attendees from different time zones of the US, EU, and APAC regions. Thank you so much for your interest in the Saraca webinars and for your registrations in such large numbers for our live webinar on roadblocks in 510K submission process. Your presence is highly appreciated, and I hope you are all doing great and staying safe. Now, let me introduce myself first. I am Ajmal Hussain, Business Development Executive, Saraca Solutions. I will be your host for today. Let me tell you some important points related to the webinar. All the participants will be muted during the live webinar session. You can note down your questions during the live webinar and ask them towards the end of the webinar, or you can also email your questions to us. And our team will be sending you certificates of participation to all the attendees who have joined our live webinar. We will also be happy to share the recorded version of this webinar at the end of the live session with all our webinar attendees. You can also find the recorded version of this webinar at our webinar section on the website, which is www.saracasolutions.com. Now let me introduce you to our first panelist of today's discussion. We have two panelists, Samuel Wade and James Brown. So Samuel Wade is a veteran in the field of medical devices, and he has a bachelor's of science in microbiology and immunology. Sam has been involved in medical device quality and regulatory field for more than 40 years. He has worked in different medical device companies on various levels, including vice president and director of quality and regulatory. He has great experience in ISO 14971, ISO 13485, and also 510K submissions. Our second panelist is James Brown. James has a Master's of Engineering in Electrical and Electronics Engineering with more than 34 years of experience in medical device industry. He has expertise in the fields of design control, risk management, and IEC 60601 safety conformity. He will share his thoughts on conformity with medical electrical systems and safety standards. Now that I have your attention, let us go through the webinar agenda first. Yeah, so this will be the timeline we will be following for today. Refusal to file, nuances in guidance documents, animals subjected to testing, common labeling problems, EMC, errors in validation process, conformity with medical electrical system safety standards, and 510 case studies. So now that I have your attention, I request Sam to start the webinar.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming and taking the time to listen to this presentation. I'd like to just make a couple of things up front as statements. This presentation is not from an FDA standpoint. The presentation we're making today are all mistakes that were either made by people I know, myself, or other people that related to me issues with submissions. These are things that can change the course of your submission by as much as 2 to 3 years due to your errors and making the proper assessments or reading the right documents. And we're going to go through some of those as we progress through the seminar. The first item that always presents itself to most people is when they come out with a device that they claim is similar to a predicate device. And that is one of the hardest things to do, is to pick an appropriate predicate device for comparison to your new device. And I'm going to tell you some issues that we've related to in the past and things to watch out for when doing so. Picking a grandfathered device, i.e. a device that the 510K has not been called for, which are very few at this point, or it's a true grandfathered device that was on the market and in distribution prior to 1976. The problem with getting any information from a grandfathered device is you don't know specifically what the labeling was approved for, what it was promoted for, and where or what it was distributed for. This makes a huge difference in what you can do with the device. So there is no 510K for free amendment devices. You'll have to get your information from labeling that's out there in the market, taking snapshots of their website, taking snapshots of the device, or obtaining samples of their labeling and their directions for use. That's one of the few ways that you can get that. Problem with that is that you don't know what the device was tested to, if anything, and you don't have copies or any indication of which standard was used, if anything. So you're going to have to do quite a bit of work to go back and get technical information on a grandfathered device to present that to FDA. Second major item is picking a device that's older than 10 years. That is something that specifically the FDA has addressed in a guidance document. And the reason for that is technology has changed a lot in the last 10 years. And the intended use may change with your filing. So picking a device that's older than 10 years is frowned upon. However, if that's the only device that's out there that may be 20, 30 years old, you can go ahead and use that. But we're going to talk a little bit about what you have to do to make sure your device is equivalent to the predicate device. Now, how do you search for a predicate device? You look for manufacturers of similar devices that are made and are in commercial distribution in the United States. Keep in mind that it doesn't help to have a snapshot in your submission of a product that's only made and distributed in Europe or Asia. It has to be done in the United States. A lot of websites are divided up into, are you in the US, are you in the EU, or are you in Asia? That helps you define where the device is being used and gives you a little bit more of a focus. The second place is to look for a device that's similar to yours and look up the product code classification in the FDA's database. This is a wealth of knowledge. I use it all the time, and I'm going to go into where you use that, not only in your submission, but in some of the contents of your device summaries and some of the other particular documents that you will have to use. Lastly, this is a huge benefit that the FDA has provided to the industries and to people who want to file a 510K, whether it be foreign, domestic, or individual, is searching the 510K database. They have various search screens that you put in the 510K number if you know it, the company if you know it, and the device name if you know it. There is one slight problem with this. Once a device is granted a 510K, they don't go back and change. For example, if Medtronic buys a company, and I don't have a specific example, but if they buy a vessel sealer from another company and register it as their own, that change does not get recorded in the database. So as we go through time, a lot of acquisitions and mergers occur. So you need to know a little bit about the history of the device to be able to get an accurate 510K. And that may take some data, it may take some detective work to determine the origination of that device. The second item that goes along with searching the 510K database is if you know the 510K number or the company. There are companies out there, for example, FOI, that can provide you with a 510K for a cost that was originally submitted. Some of the data will be redacted in that it's crossed off because it's considered confidential material by the company, and you won't be able to read that. But you can discern from that 510K a lot of testing data, their thoughts, the technology, and so forth of that particular device, and that may enable you to complete the information that you need to submit in a good 510K. In the assessment of a predicate device, there is a guidance document, an excellent guidance document that I use all the time, so I won't have to memorize it. It's called the 510K program, Evaluating Substantial Equivalence in Pre-Market Notifications. It's published by published in 7/14 by FDA. And again, I use this all the time. It tells you the correct format on how to lay out a 510K. It tells you how to evaluate substantial equivalence and what they look for. There are some things that you can't do when you're doing predicate devices, and I'll go into those in a couple minutes. It tells you various other things that you need to do and gives you some guidance on assessing where different technological characteristics raise different questions of safety and efficacy. And that's important because you need to be able to establish that your device raises no new questions of safety or efficacy. And you have to be able to demonstrate that through performance testing, assessment, and a comparison of pros and cons of the new versus old device. It may mean that you have to go back and look at the original performance data and do a gap analysis of the original performance data and the new testing that's now required to have the device on the market. And you may be surprised in the differences. As I said previously, technology has changed quite a bit even in the last couple of years. And the testing required to demonstrate performance testing in a new device may be totally different than the one that was done originally, say 5 to 10 years ago. So you need to do a gap analysis, and you need to be able to show that your testing is equivalent to the predicate device. You need to take into consideration that the new device with new indications may end up with a new intended use. And you need to be able to say that the intent indications for use have the same intended use as the predicate device. In order to do this, you may need to use multiple predicate devices. This is done quite a bit. You use your device, a predicate device, and there may be a reference device that was done a long time ago that you go back to point out various issues. What you can't do is split predicate devices. For example, if you have a catheter with a balloon on it, you can't go back and say, well, this 510K has a catheter, this 510K has a balloon. So if you add the balloon to the catheter, boom, you got a new device. That's a no-no. You can't do that. Assure that you can get copies of the 510Ks that are meaningful. As you go back in time, some of the 510Ks that are out there have a 510K summary that are 1 page long. And you can get some points of consideration for that, but you're going to have to do some work to get meaningful data that allows you to do an adequate comparison. If you don't, the FDA is left in the predicament where they can't make a meaningful comparison, and they're going to come back to you and say, we're not in a position to be able to do an adequate comparison, and that's going to cost you time. The last one is something that happens to me almost routinely, and that is inaccuracy or mistakes in the CDRH pre-market review submission cover sheet. And there are multiple reasons for this. When I work with various companies or my own company, there are various people that put together sections of the 510K. And normally what happens is regulatory puts together those sections and you read through them and you put them together in a manner that you're going to use to submit the device. The problem with that is different people may have written the different sections and you may have different terminology. And by the time I end up reviewing it 3 and 4 times, some of those things don't stand out to me anymore. So I recommend that you have a number of people that review the device and someone that has not worked with it that reviews it for English, ensuring that the indications for use are the same throughout the submission. Because if not, the FDA will return that or send you a letter that says you have different indications for use. They all need to be the same. This is particularly true when you have, say, marketing putting together a sales sheet that you include in the sales sheet that's included in the 510K. And it has either new indications that were not in the original 510K or the indications for use vary slightly. So you want to make sure that it's consistent all the way through. Now, there are small inaccuracies, and unfortunately, I made an error in not insisting that this be a full-size document, but this is one of the most important documents in your submission other than your summaries. This is FDA 3514, and it's the pre-market submission review sheet. And there is a place up in here that you have to put your PIN number that the FDA assigns to you when you demonstrate that you have paid for your submission. And as a point of fact, every year this number changes how much you have to pay for. And there's a little clue if your company is a smaller company of a certain size and a certain sales, you can file with the FDA based on taxes and your revenues, and this is based upon submissions to IRS. You can get quite a substantial discount on filing 510Ks under the small company program. And this can result in savings of $10,000, $12,000. So this is a place you can save money. There's several areas in here that you have to be careful of. There's same sheet compares or includes information on IDEs, 510Ks, PMAs, and other various submissions, Q subs and so forth. You have to be sure that when you pick out the right one. So for 510Ks, there's a section in here that concentrates strictly on 510Ks, and those vary from page to page. You need to put in your name, address, contact number. If it's a new 510K and you're a new company, you don't have to put the registration in because you probably won't have it. Subsequent filings after you get your registration will need to be included in here. However, there's a section farther down where you need to include your code, your product code, your predicate submission 510Ks, your intended population. All these things are included in this document. This is, from my standpoint, more 510Ks get rejected at this stage than any other stage. You need to be really careful that this document is complete and it's covered quite thoroughly in the guidance document. On guidance documents, you need to do a very thorough search of guidance documents that pertain to your device. Now, there may not be just one, there may be several. For example, in lasers, there is a specific guidance document for lasers. There are specific IEC documents for a laser. It's 1-2-22. Jim will get into that. And guidance documents are changing at a furious rate. So what I used to do earlier in my career is I'd print out a guidance document, put it in this huge reference document, and put it up on the shelf. And that's not a good thing to do. It's very easy to go to the FDA website, pull the latest guidance document, and you need to determine not only the one that you find, but you need to do a thorough search to make sure that all the applicable guidance documents are included in for your device. You're gonna need to list them at some point, and you need to be able to ascertain that you covered all of the pertinent things that are in a guidance document. Like I said, don't depend on guidance documents tucked in the shelf. Pull a new search every time, and make sure you read them thoroughly. There are things in the guidance document that refer subtly to a comparison performance specifications, and it only may be a sentence, but it changes your whole submission, and you need to be able to review it in detail. Comments made in the document may be important to demonstrate substantial equivalence. And the last point I wanted to make is guidance documents don't always cross-reference with each other's well. Some of these guidance documents are fairly old, and I've run into instances where the guidance document was old and references one method, and the guidance document that's news, that is brand new, may reference another procedure or another method of doing so. If you have a question, you have multiple ways of answering that. One is take it upon yourself to do both. The second one is to call the FDA. They have several ways of helping you. They have a small division that deals with small companies. You can file a Q-sub to ask some of these questions, make sure you're on the right track, or you can call your reviewer if you know a reviewer and ask them for some guidance. FDA is very helpful, and once they receive a 510K, they want to make sure it goes through in a minimum amount of time. They want new technology on the market, but they also want it to be safe and effective. So anything you can do to make their job easier, including all the documentation that they need to make that determination, will be in your own self-interest. As I said, guidance documents don't always cross-reference well, and you have to make sure that what you're submitting agrees with both, or find out which one is no longer applicable. Again, my guidance is if you find a new guidance document that says you no longer must do something, I include it anyways, and then you're covered. Or call FDA and determine which one is applicable and which one they want to look for. The only thing I caution is you have new reviewers and you have old reviewers. Some of the folks in the FDA review process have years of experience on this, and some of them are relatively new. So you want to make sure that the new ones have all the right documents in place that they know will be required, whereas the more experienced ones say, well, you don't need to do that. But to be sure, make sure you do both or call them. Secondarily, the older guidance documents may have different requirements for performance testing. Highly recommend you do a gap analysis on the predicate testing that was performed and look at the testing that's now required. For example, on 10993-1, some of the subparts of 10993 now require new techniques and a new analysis. So you want to make sure that you do a gap analysis on the 10993 or biocompatibility testing, and make sure your testing was valid. You can't just go through and check off a box and say it's done. You got to make sure it's done to the testing now required or state of the art, and you need to ensure your device matches the indicated use and indications for use of the predicate device. Also review similar devices recently cleared and review device summaries to determine if the testing now being required that you may have missed in your review of the guidance document is now being covered. That was a mistake that was made by a company I worked with. They missed a total requirement on EMC testing, and they missed a requirement on 10993 testing. And also the performance test was one that's done on all heat sealing devices, and it's based upon books that were written by a Dr. Devashish Shrivastava of FDA. He's written 2 volumes on heat transfer in humans. They're $200 on Amazon, $100 a volume. They tell you how to do heat transfer, and you have to be able to prove that your vessel sealer doesn't do more heat damage than the predicate, which is a reasonable thing to be able to say substantial equivalence. This book is very definitive. Above, I describe the various process that you have to go through. You take your target tissue. It's got to be fresh target tissue. So if you're doing the tongue, for example, you have to go get fresh tongue from the slaughterhouse. You have to bring it back, stain it, then fix it all within 2 hours, and then you can send it to be analyzed by knowledgeable pathologists. They look at the heat pattern, and it's looked at by viable mitochondria versus non-viable mitochondria, and they give you an analysis of the data they found. If you don't have this, how can you make the comparison with your predicate device? I think it's a pretty reasonable assumption. And again, performance testing performed on the predicate device may need to be repeated in a manner performed on the predicate. What I mean by that, if performance testing on the predicate was done in a very specific way, you may need to go back and do your new device in the same manner. Gap analysis of standards and performance testing versus requirements now being tested is quite different. You need to do a gap analysis to ensure that your new device matches your old device in what is now necessary. Key point is that I want to bring out, if you're doing standards testing to IEC 10993-1, at this point in time, FDA's is slightly different and requires more testing than the IEC version. And FDA has a guidance document on this that tells you and shows you and tells you how to do it, the various components of 10993 and the differences. Highly recommend that you read both. Labeling issues. One of the things that always comes out when you're doing review is people miss the inconsistent use of symbols throughout the document. And that's changed over the years. For example, an R with a cross through it is now single use only. There are standard symbols that are now being used on medical devices worldwide. However, the use in your 510K is not consistent with that, and you need to ensure that they are. Particularly in the marketing literature of old marketing literature that was prepared prior to the device being ready to go out with the 510K, it may be different. So you need to make sure that your labeling is reviewed by somebody who's very used to doing labeling review. And again, inconsistent language throughout your submission. And if you go back to that form I pointed out, your indicated use is also on that form. A lot of times I will do that form first, and then we make subtle changes to the indications for use, and we never go back and change that form. And they will come back to you. They may be nice to you and send you an email, but they almost may send you a email that says, be prepared to receive a letter that you have to answer in writing. That process can take 1 to 2 weeks. Make sure you include your intended population. That's more specific than it used to be. And again, it's got to be within your device summary as well as in form 3514. A lot of people fail to follow accepted labeling standards. There is an old labeling requirements guidance document for medical devices. It was published in 1989. It's number 4203. You have to be sure that if you're an electromechanical device, that your labeling follows IEC 60601-1, and they treat labeling as a critical component. One thing I want to point out with IEC 60601-1 is while this is acceptable to FDA, it costs a lot of money to do testing with 60601-1 and all its ancillary and collateral state standards. So if you're thinking, even now, about going to Europe at some point in the future, you want to make sure that your testing is done to EN 60601-1, which is the European version. If you don't do it to that, you're going to have to repeat it. And some of this testing takes a long time to do, and it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. The IEC standard for medical device labeling, ISO 15223-1, has now been upgraded to 15221-1 2021. It was just changed, and it identifies new requirements and different symbols used in medical device labeling. Although this is an international labeling, I suspect it will receive consensus review by FDA at some point in the near future. Again, have multiple personnel who are not responsible for the assembly or writing of the 510 review for spelling, accuracy, inaccuracy statements. It should be somebody that actually who is not part of the team, somebody who is looking at it for the first time and will see those differences that we who have done it many times miss. And sometimes it can cause considerable delay if you're wrong. You may not have to go back, and even though we submit directions for use as a draft, they'll still pick it out. It happens to me almost all the time, and you need to change it, or they'll want a different mechanism. So I don't recommend that you go ahead and print out a final draft or a final copy and include that in your 510. Okay, you can almost always expect to have changes made or requested in the document. Unless you have a very good reason as to why it shouldn't be, you're going to need to change it. Ensure translation, if you're considering going to Europe, is done now. It's certified and performed and reviewed in the country under consideration. This is called localization. In other words, if you're considering going to Europe, this would be a good time to do that. And there's a reason for that. If you run it through Google Translate, it does not come out in the idiopathic method that's used by the specific country, and your language in that country may not be accepted by that country. And that's true for countries like Switzerland that have their own requirement, Switzerland, Sweden, and a couple others that have their own requirements for labeling. If you don't do it under localization, some of your labeling will come out to be quite funny. Well, funny when you look back on it, not so funny when it occurs to you. Ensure a more successful 510 pay I included labeling from the predicate 510K that's being considered. And that way a reviewer can go back and look at your literature versus their marketing literature. I take screenshots from the website to assure FDA that it is currently in commercial distribution in this country. I take material from the 510K database and include it in a separate section. So again, a reviewer can go back and look at the original 510K summary and compare it to what you're doing. I take pictures of the device. I use published scientific literature to show the device has been out there for a while and that there are no new sources of safety or efficacy that have been raised in the scientific literature since it was released. And I always include directions for use if they're available. Older issues and some of these things may be difficult to get, but if you work to get them, you can obtain them. 510K summaries. As you know, 510K summaries that you include with the 510K are not required. You can say that you will do a certificate, but at the rate people are moving around, I can almost guarantee you that at some point in the future, say 2 years, somebody will do a request for a summary. Then you find that the people who actually wrote the 510K are now working in East Oshkosh, Washington, as opposed to Massachusetts. And you can't get a hold of them and use them to determine what was meant by this. Write it now in the language that's being drafted for the executive 510K, and you include the amount of material you know will be requested, but not including confidential material. That way you'll have it. It's easier to file it now, so it doesn't cause extra delay. I mean, you go out and look for the same material and you get irritated if there's a certificate there. So do it now, make sure the material is consistent. It will save you time and effort in the future. Summaries that go out to the public need to include the similarities of the new device to the old device, any differences to the new device versus the old device, and do these differences or similarities raise any new issues of safety or efficacy? And if so, why do they not matter? Executive summaries need to have a clear and concise description of the device, its intended use, and the technologies used to manufacture that device. These days, software changes quite a bit, quite rapidly, and you need to be able to compare software. And there's a whole guidance document on the use of software in medical devices. Recommend that you read that. It does have a comparison in there on the level and description of concern for software contained in the device, the sections that will be required, the verification, validation of the software. Cybersecurity is a huge issue right now. And if your device is linked via the Net of Things or to outside via a plugin, or that you need a thumb drive to be able to upgrade it, how are you going to control the thumb drives? How are you going to control the upgrades? And can somebody else mitigate your cybersecurity? And again, refer to the FDA guidance document software. The device comparison table of the new device as compared to the predicate device. You need a table that outlines the similarities and the differences. And this should include things like weight, intended use, if it's a laser, how the laser is generated, the number of volts that is required, the pulse length, the pulse standard, things like that. Same thing as you would do for a balloon catheter, burst strength, material that it's made out of, and so forth. You need to have a summary of the standards testing. This doesn't mean you include the entire standard testing that was done and the results. You need to have a summary and the conclusions that were reached and a nice little summary that people can read. And finally, you need a concise summary of any performance testing that's in their in the submission, a summary of the testing performed, the type of testing, test methods, conclusions, and any copies of testing protocols and the reports should be included in the submission. While the reports are not specifically mentioned in many cases, you will get a call that says, I want to know what the results of the testing protocols were. So save yourself some time and include them. They should be put into a section of the 510K that's readily identified, and I usually put these in appendices. Again, the guidance documents for construction of a 510K outline the various sections. They look for roughly 20 sections, and this will pertain to e-copy in a minute. Let me go back to summaries again. There's executive summaries, there's 510K summaries, and as part of the device, this is not a summary, but the device description. And the way I do a 510K is I always do the device description first. This may be a number of pages long, but in it, you do a comparison of the predicate versus your new device. You do a summary of testing. You do so much in the device description that by the time you're done with it, executive summaries and the 510K summaries are really just subcomponents of that. And this way, you can make sure that the content is very similar for all the different sections. Highly recommend you do that. Okay, they're EMC and standards testing. This is one of the areas that causes the most consternation for any standards. You need to determine what electrical standards may apply to your device and any other standards that may apply. Jim will go into a great deal of detail on electrical standards, so I'm not going to cover that in any detail. But for example, there are laser standards that are applicable to only lasers. And if you have pressure tanks within your laser containing nitrogen, or you plug into an outside source, or you have an oxygen cylinder within your device, these all have pressure standards on them. And you need to consider what those are, and when they go into your device, are they changed? They also have a number of different standards for pressure vessels in Europe. And while we're not talking about Europe, I highly suggest that you look at that at this point, because you may need to end up going back and referring or refurbishing your device to be able to penetrate Europe, Far East, or the Middle East markets. Almost everybody has a different adapter. Ensure your design meets the applicable standards. And that means you don't wait till the end of the device engineering stage or the marketing stage, and you didn't take 1497 or risk management into consideration at the beginning stage. That needs to be done. You need to determine what risk your device has at the essential performance stage, when you're essentially going out and determine what the customers are needing or what the market needs in the field, trying it out, talking to the people that will use this device. If you wait till the end of the marketing stage and you can't mitigate it, you just spent a year or two going through a device, medical device development process, and you're going to have to go back and change it. underestimating the time necessary to test your device by your testing agency. If you have an electromechanical device and it has to be tested by, say, UL, TUV Rhineland, or Entertech, these right now are inundated with devices that are needed to be testing to meet the MDR requirements. They're not just doing testing for the US. So they are completely inundated with testing requirements, and your ability to get on their schedule may be limited. I also highly recommend, if you haven't done any testing on your device, and for example, just taken, say, the device specifications for a power supply from China, and you put it in your device and expect it to meet your noise level or emissions level, I can guarantee you that probably won't happen because they give you an analysis that's at the very top of the spec now, and your device will fail. So you need to do some preliminary testing. I recommend you do pre-testing at 2 or 3 levels. And then when you're considered your device testing to be complete, you've gone through a pre-testing, everything looks copacetic, then you consider your final testing. It will cut down on the amount of testing you're doing. And again, schedule those in advance so you consider time. And again, this is another thing where just doing IEC testing is not going to be adequate. You need to do the EN standard if you're going to go into Europe. And if you don't, you're going to end up doing testing all over again. And it's lengthy and it's costly. The IEC standard 60601-1 requires review of your risk management file and the usability work that you did on your device. It used to be sufficient to let your agency do that risk analysis and the review and the usability review. However, FDA is reviewing not only the risk management and usability file, they're actually reviewing the standard testing itself. And I know some people where balloons were put in line to cut down a noisy line coming from the outside that's not in the standard, and testing had to be redone. Fortunately, it was the testing house that had to redo it, but you don't want to end up in the middle of an argument between FDA, your testing house, and yourself. It's not a good place to be. The other thing I want to mention about 14971 is a lot of companies are not looking at 14971 as what I would call an all-encompassing standard. They're going out and doing a risk management review. They've got a nice file in place. Maybe they review it once a year, maybe they don't, but there is a time requirement and how often it's reviewed by top management. It has to be signed off by top management. And then you can't put it in a file and dust it off every once in a while. It's a comprehensive document that flows throughout your entire QMS system. It intertwines with your audit system, your post-market surveillance system. Every time you come in with a new complaint that is not in your risk management file, you have to go back and change your file. And if it's not upgraded and they see that you have a complaint that's not in there, you're going to have to change it, and that will result in a non-conformity. Just the same, if you don't go back in your audit and after a year make sure that the standard or the audit finding is still corrected, you'll get an observation on that. So it's very intertwined. It's no longer just a silo that sits on a desk someplace. It's intertwined with your entire QMS system. Uh, 10993 has changed recently, all over the last several years. It used to be that you had in the guidance document a series of testing that was done, and all you do is check off the box and say that you did it. That's all changed now. It requires the personnel making the decision for testing for biocompatibility. They have to be qualified by training, education, or both. Their credentials are required to be in the 10993 file, along with the signatures. Be aware that, again, that the FDA requirements at this time are slightly different than the ISO requirements. Be aware that there are many parts to 10993 currently, and ensure you have the most recent issue and the most recent, you look through all the different parts. There are 24 parts or thereabouts at this point, and some of those address former components of 10993 that are totally different than they were before. This is where the predicate device comes in, because if it's older than 5 years, you're going to have to do a gap analysis, and you may be surprised by how the testing was done, what kind of testing was done, and what it was done on. There is a general push these days on almost all the regulatory authorities to get away from animal testing. There used to be testing done in rabbits, used to be testing done in pigs, and there used to be testing done in baboons and primates. In some countries, you can't do that kind of testing any longer. For example, it is no longer, you're no longer able to do animal testing in Europe, in the UK. For example, you can't even boil lobsters live in the UK anymore. They just passed that law last week. I don't know if it's law currently, but there is a sensitivity to using animals. And the more animals you use, the more sensitive they are to this requirement. So if I were you and I was going through 10993 requirements, I would look and see if there is an alternate requirement to using an animal, to using for example, a cell line, using a WI38 or a L929 cell line. There are a lot of these out there right now, and they're becoming more and more prevalent. FDA has a whole group that's looking at changing away from animal testing to looking at standardized testing in a standardized mechanism, so that you can use a similar system that's not in vitro, that's in vitro and not in vivo testing to ensure that your device is the same. This is a big effort in this part. If you have a chance to participate with this group, I'd highly recommend that you do it. Again, in 10993, there's a requirement for levels now, and if you exceed those levels, you have to explain why it's okay to exceed those testing levels, or find a way to get blown. They not only want to know what kind of plastic you have, but what's in the plastic, what kind of UV inhibitors, what kind of colors that you have in there. And they want those levels known. You just can't check the box anymore. Check and recheck the ISO standards for your device, the FDA's guidance documents, and the FDA's current consensus standards. Some standards, if you fall under them, will take considerable time and money to complete. Some testing takes up to 16 weeks or more to do. The heat transfer testing I was talking about took 6 weeks to do, and finding qualified pathologists and equipment to do it. Validation issues. I'm just going to cover this briefly. Validation in general refers to proving a medical device meets the user needs and the intended use. This goes along with making sure that you're validating to ensure that your device meets its performance specifications. That's very important. This has become a huge issue. You can do validation, you can put the device out in the field, and it doesn't meet the user needs, and therefore it's essential performance. That's critical. Important proper assessment of the user needs by the actual users. This is something you can't do in a lab in your facility unless you have actual users who are going to use that device inside your facility, and they give you input on its use. There are many ways to do this. Going out to the users in hospitals, going to conventions, doing surveys, but the best way is to go talk to the actual users in the environment that's going to be used and determine the essential performance and the user needs. The second most largest problem is improper translation of the customer needs into concepts. And this happens a lot during the R&D stage, where engineers take the ideas that they've received into the field, from the field, and put them into concepts. Form doesn't always follow what the customers want. And engineers have a tendency to either make it more complicated or less complicated. And it may not end up being the needs of what the customer is actually looking for. An inadequate design of experiments. You need to be able to have this under control and understand how you design experiments to exploit the number of samples, the power of those samples, and ensure you have the right numbers to ensure that the device is not going to fail in the field in the time frame that you assess it. A lot of customers that I've had say, well, we're going to use this for 5 years, but they never validate that time frame. And Jim will get into that more. Improper statistical analysis of user sample size. It used to be that when FDA would come in, well, how many samples you use? Well, I use 3, 3 defines a point. Oh, okay. Well, now they want to know, and rightfully so, how did you determine the sample size? And how do you as a company, not necessarily FDA, because this protects you as a company, how do you determine the sample size? I worked for a company that used 45 samples, and they did not fail till we got beyond that sample size. So the power of that sample size was not enough to detect the potential production issues that we had with that particular device. There used to be people out there who would say, well, let's test it till it works and we get the right numbers. You can't do that any longer. Some of these are the result or result in field withdrawals or field complaints or worse, class 1 medical device recalls. And if you look at the number of medical device recalls recently, there are a number of them every month, and some of them are quite serious. That all shows that the proper use, the design of the intended life was not adequate, and it has to be. The inadequate sample size of prototype product to determine if performance parameters are met. FDA doesn't say that you have to use finished devices, but what they do say is the FDA expects you to use production equivalent. Can't be made by engineers who know what they're doing, make modifications. It has to be done by the people who you expect to make those devices and the processes used to make them. And that results in inadequate evidence or justification for the samples being used in production equivalent. Additional validation issues that arise: inadequate risk assessment, the failure to take interaction between variables into consideration, failure in adequate test method validation. What that means is you just can't write a test that you think will validate the essential performance or validate the use of a device in your production methods. You have to make sure that your test method is validated too. You may have shipping testing that's inadequate. Some people just put it on a plane ship it to someplace and bring it back by truck. That may or may not be adequate for shipping testing because it doesn't take all the considerations into place. For example, the back of a truck in Phoenix, Arizona reaches 140 degrees Fahrenheit this time of year. Of course, that number is from 5 years ago, so it may be a lot hotter now. The field testing requirements were inadequate. They are not used in the room that people expect it to be used. For example, lasers produce a lot of heat, and you can't put those into a closet and use them. They have to have adequate ventilation, adequate circulation for the people that are in there, and ensure that there's adequate turnover and filtration. So if you do it in an open area and you're doing your field testing in a lab, that's not a simulation that's going to work in the field. Inadequate supply chain control and quality analysis of parts. If you do not have control over your suppliers, you're not going to have control over the products that are being used in your product. There can be changes made if you don't do some kind of quality analysis, either at the production site of the parts or at incoming. You can have various changes that may affect the performance of your product. There is a document out there, GHTF/SG/3/N99-10, Quality Management Systems, Process Validation Guidance. There's another one out there, ICH Q2, validation of analytical procedures, tests, and methodology. These are all useful in to determine whether your process validation is adequate to detect products that may not meet your performance specifications. E-copy. You need to understand e-copy if you're going to submit your 510K and have it accepted into a document control. I'm not going to go into the whole process here. The thing to understand is that FDA wrote a whole e-copy program for medical device submissions. It's dated 3/21 and it's used for 510K submissions right now. And it's not hard to follow, but you need to understand the program to be able to get it through. And one of the most common mistakes is you don't follow the technical standards. They have to be done in a certain manner. And there are e-copy validations modules that you can download from the e-copy program that allows you to check for errors in formatting. The most recent editions were released in November 2020. There's a 64-bit, 32-bit, and Mac version that can be found on the e-copy website. It's very simple. You download these onto your computer that you're going to use to make your copy for submission. And you run it through on either your CD, DVD, or your flash drive, and it tells you whether it meets the technical standards or not. There are technical standards that are mentioned in eSubmitter's eCopies tool, and it's a quick reference guide. And again, these allow you to check for errors before you ship it. I've been with companies that have shipped these things in the FDA. You get a very quick turnaround time. Either it meets it or it doesn't. You'll get a letter that says we accepted it. Then you'll get a letter the next day that says it didn't meet the standard. You need to submit one that does. PDF files on eCopy are set up in a very, very specific manner. They must begin with 001 underscore and continue to count consecutively. There is an example in the eCopy guidance document. And what I do is I compare the guidance document on 510K submissions with this. And the first document that's in my submission would be volume VOL underscore 001 underscore in the title. And I use the title that's actually in the 510K guidance document. And then below that, there are sections, and sections begin with sections underscore 001, 002, and so forth. Again, with the underscore in the name of the document. And those names pretty much coincide with the names in the 510K guidance document. This allows them to break apart the e-document once it's arrived and send those electronically to the various reviewers. There's not one reviewer anymore. There are a number of different reviewers that are experts in software, validation, all kinds of different reviewers, and they do this as a group, and then there's one chief reviewer, if you will, that you have contact with. Use file names that are utilized in the guidance document for ease of review for the reviewer, not for you, but for the reviewer. You want to make sure that they can go and determine where that section is in the 510K. Now, if you have other documents that don't easily file into those sections, I use appendices. For example, I have appendices 1, predicate device material, appendices 2, validation documentation, appendices 3, IEC testing documentation, and so forth. That makes it very easy for the reviewer to find this material. There are 2 differences in eCopy. For CDRH, you must attach a paper copy of your company's cover letter, including signature, to the eCopy itself and mail it. For CBER, you are required to include your company cover letter within the eCopy thumb drive itself. There is a caution here. FDA recommends the size of the eCopy on your thumb drive or whatever media be less than 1 gigabyte. Anything more will delay the submission. And there are a couple ways to review the size, reducing the size of large files when possible. For example, photos, x-rays, videos, they tend to be very large. And maybe you can reduce the size of these to a smaller size. And maybe you can put device information among different folders. I'm now going to turn this over to Jim, who's an expert in this field, and let Jim take over the presentation from here on in. Thank you for your attention. I know this is not exactly the most exciting material in the world, but this will prevent some serious delay on your part in getting things through easily. At least get it reviewed and get the substantial review in progress.
Thank you, Sam. Now I request James to please walk us through his presentation.
Yes, hi, can you hear me, folks?
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you all for this opportunity to present this material to you. I'm a design assurance engineer, and my expertise in the area of 60601's design for safety to medical electrical systems safety standards. I'm going to provide an overview of the current trend and stance that the FDA has recently been taking toward 510Ks based on experiences within my companies and also interacting with other companies that have experienced some of these themes I'm going to bring forward in this presentation. So to start with, anyone who develops and submits a medical electrical system product, whether it be a piece of equipment or a system that contains electronics and single-use swap-out devices, will all fall under this family of standards for 60601. There is an array of standards as I show here, being the collateral standards as well that are an extension of this general standard, as well as there are particular safety standards depending on the type of equipment or system that you're developing, you're submitting. The one thing of note that I'd like to bring to the attention is the home environment standards now being, say, utilized more than ever. We have devices going home, heart pumps that keep people alive, insulin pumps that attach to your body and keep your insulin at a proper level, glucose metering systems, measuring systems that you can measure at home, or it's doing it remotely to your cell phone on the back of your arm, dialysis systems, and even Apple Watches with cardiac monitoring functions. So that home environment standard is getting utilized more than ever in this IoT environment that we're in, and the go home is better than staying in a hospital environment. And one thing of note is to ensure that everyone recognizes that all of these safety standards address basic safety and essential performance. Basic safety is a component of the 601 standards and always has been part of safety standards, but this new introduction of essential performance is where people are having more challenges lately that I will get into. That is important that we understand what we need to do in advance before we get a rejection of our submission because we didn't address it. So the theme of this is having your 601 test report doesn't guarantee you meet the 601 standard in its full glory. And this is where I will be bringing forward these aspects of 510K submissions that are getting held up and challenged. The FDA has taken a more hard stance in this area, have bolstered up their expertise, our understanding of what the standards are asking for. And the reason being is because there's class 1 recalls that have been occurring that these test houses aren't challenging the products enough. They don't know how to challenge essential performance. Basic safety, that's always been in their back pocket over the years, but essential performance is where people struggle more. And these three aspects I'm highlighting here have correlations to each other. They're not independent. Essential performance actually touches upon both of those other terms, which is expected service life and how you manage electromagnetic compatibility through your design. And if you do not understand those correlations, because the standard is pretty large in those particular standards of, well, how do you determine it and what do you do with it? And if you don't understand those standards and your test house doesn't help you to comply fully, then you may have to remediate your products, which have taken up to 2 to 3 years from companies' case studies, which I'll share with you in a moment. But it's pretty significant and substantial to your, say, launch process, your market opportunity, your return on investment, if you can't get your products through the regulatory process. So here's some case studies of essential performance being a holdup in 510K submissions. And these have occurred from speaking with various people in the industry that have had this happen to them. It's not pretty to tell your program management, I'm sorry that we have a holdup and we need to remediate, and then it goes up the chain that right to the shareholders, well, your growth is not going to be meeting your plan because we have delays in new growth. So these have hurt these companies in these areas, and they're all related to essential performance. The company's not understanding it, addressing it properly, and some of them thought they understood it and really didn't understand it. So there's a whole myriad of levels of expertise or lack thereof in this area of essential performance, which I will include in my presentation here. So the first item here is this is right from the 60601 definition, and it was updated in 2012 in edition 3.1. It was first introduced in edition 3.0 in 2005. So it's been around 15, 16 years now, the term, but more clarity was brought to it in 2012. So it's been in existence for 8 to 9 years now in this form you see in front of you. Now, what's important to note is that this time period that we specify, your equipment, here's everything's bound upon. This is a loaded definition. that once you set this definition and you follow this, you're held to a standard of whatever that time period that you define. It has implications to your customer and the safety of your device. And that is to maintain basic safety and essential performance. Folks weren't getting it, and that's why that the clarification was made, and their interpretation sheets, which I'll discuss in the next slide, briefly has made more clear of what essential performance actually is. And maintenance can be necessary over that time you define, whether it be 5 years, 7, or 10 years. So questions that have come from the FDA have been in the forms of these. And the first one is, if a preventative maintenance schedule is necessary, please validate it to ensure it's effective over that whole expected service life. This came from a company that had a 10-year expected service life. They devised a preventive maintenance schedule based on a reliability study, and they proved that it worked for 1 year. And the FDA said, well, what about years 2 through 10? The same preventive maintenance schedule procedure still work at each one of those annual preventive maintenance activities. And they had to go back to the drawing board. It took them time, took them years to actually start, studying it, the failure rates, the application to actually prove it was effective. It could really hurt you. Also, how has essential performance been demonstrated to be reliably maintained over the expected service life? There again, essential performance pokes up, and that really means, is it safe for its clinical use over the time frame you stated to ensure that it provides the proper functionality and safely to specification. And the last one is, there's no information that is included or effectively documented in the instructions for use for all instructions for maintaining basic safety and essential performance with regard to electromagnetic disturbances over the expected service life. That is a mouthful. How do you keep the product safe, basic safety and EP, when it's undergoing electromagnetic disturbances in the environment of intended use over that 10 years? These folks, and all folks, are expected to make sure they understand that through the application of risk management, their design architecture, and their verification of effectiveness, that it lasts that long. Now you're talking reliability studies that folks hadn't planned for before or hadn't conducted in its full, say, review for essential performance and basic safety over that time frame. A case in point for this was, there was a PM that was performed on an infusion pump that actually caused a failure of essential performance. It resulted in a Class 1 recall in 2020, and it caused the pump to shut, their insulin pump to shut down. So their maintenance wasn't effective, their instructions weren't effective, and the way to control that was ineffective. So part of this, again, is that the FDA is taking a stance of, we're going to challenge you now because we actually approved that device. You had a 601 test report, we let it go through, but the 601 test report in the test house did not kick the tires enough, and the manufacturer didn't do the work detailed enough to ensure it was safe for the inspected service life.
James,
Yes.
take just a moment. We are actually running out of time, so if you can wrap
I'll speed it up. Yes.
Yeah, please,
Okay.
Please.
So these are definitions, and this is the theme that I wanted to present here in essential performance, that it's the foundation of everything, and understanding that it's different from basic safety. And there are questions that come from the FDA. And one of this, the main thing to note is that essential performance and expected service life came to be in edition 3.0 of the 60601, and it introduced risk management at that point in time. So the main story here is risk management drives your whole design process to make sure that it's safe for basic safety and essential performance. And there are questions that come from the FDA that challenge that, and the FDA gets active and involved to make sure that happens. And with the electromagnetic disturbances, there's the FDA challenges those test reports coming directly from a test house and asks their own questions because the test reports are not complete. And there is a guidance document that you can look at through the FDA website that gives you a good insight to what they actually do look for. And it gives you the guidance on how to get there to some degree. So those are important elements that if you do not cover, you will have challenges that will put you behind in a remediation situation. So I believe this is my last slide, so I appreciate your time today, and we'll open up to questions.
Thank you, James. That was a wonderful presentation, and thank you, Sam, as well. So now I request the audience to please post their questions in the questions section, and I'll be happy to forward them to our experts. Sam, can you see the questions right now?
So the first one is, I'd like to know about the can IEC 601-1 edition 3.2 be considered for compliance testing with the U.S. as a target market? If yes, should we approach the test lab for both the test standard and let them know that the device should be tested for IEC 601-1 edition 3.2, and do they do the testing also for the U.S. national difference of the standard? James, would you like to answer that one?
Absolutely. Yeah, this has just come up. It was just released, this 3.2 edition in 2020. We've done a gap analysis where I work, and know that by the time that this is the old standards withdrawn and they enforce this new one, we will be required to go back and do retesting and redesign potentially to ensure we meet the 3.2. So test houses, and I would recommend any manufacturer, if you're developing a product today, to start working to that, because you'll have to remediate by the time you launch or shortly thereafter. You will be doing remediation work, and if your product's already on the market, you're going to have to go back and retest minimally and potentially redesign if you don't meet the latest standard. So there are some very critical changes in that standard, and then there's some editorial, and then there are some things that you review that may actually impact your certification status of your product. So highly recommended to consider that as soon as possible in your development process. I hope I answered that question.
Is there any template or draft report have for 510K submission of devices? Yes, there is a guidance document that the FDA has promulgated for how to do a 510K submission, and in there is a complete template for both traditional special 510Ks, and there is another one where all the requirements and the outlines and a brief description of each section is included in there. I highly recommend you get it. It's very useful. I use it all the time, and I've been doing this in the business for many, many years. The second question is, how many samples are required for the 510K submission for the placed medical devices? And as I mentioned in the presentation, the samples depend upon what your production is like. Is it a constant production? And what you have to do is look at your statistical analysis and depend upon that. There is no set number. You have to be able to show where you got the number from. In some cases, it may be 3, but I can guarantee you that's not enough to represent your production of your device. So you need to determine your own statistical sample size, the power of that statistical size, and whether that's going to reveal enough power to determine if your process is stable. And that's a many-tiered project. Again, there are some computer programs and many books written on the subject. Highly recommend that you get Minitab. I use that for a lot, but you need to understand the various analysis required to do that and use that. If it's a case of a new device, can it still get a 510K? Yes, it can. You have to be very careful about that device and be able to prove that it's substantially equivalent to a device that was on the market prior to 76. And again, you can use devices that may be similar to yours that were approved recently and use as a predicate device, or you may have to go back in time. But yes, you can get a 510K for a new device, but it depends upon what the indications for use are, the intended use, and the technology. I mean, is it really a new device? You may have to consider whether it's a PMA device at that point. Why don't 510Ks have summaries? Well, the actual question is, why doesn't many 510Ks have summaries? Well, you're not required to have a 510K summary. You can either provide a 510K summary, or you can provide a certification that if somebody wants a 510K summary, they will ask for it. And then what will happen is FDA will send you the 510K and ask you to redact. Redact means take out any confidential equipment, information that may be included in that 510K. Then you send it back to the FDA and they will forward it to the person who requested it. So some people do it as a way of keeping confidential material out of people's hands, or what they think is confidential. But so much information is published on the web these days. As a practical matter, I don't see a reason not to provide a 510K summary. On a practical matter, you can control what kind of information goes in there. Some of the information may be redacted that you want that doesn't need to be redacted. It's easier to put it in. In these days, people are moving around like crazy, and the people that developed that device may not even be in your company anymore. So it's pretty hard to write a device summary without the people that developed it. But that's why. For a 510K submission, where one of the components, software component, has been 510K cleared from a different company, what documents are expected to be submitted to the agency? The same documents that are expected in their guidance document, validation of software. And in that document, there is a list of requirements. You know, what is the concern level? What is the validation? They're looking to make sure that it's accurately validated and verified. There needs to be a list of items that were developed for the specific 510K, for the specific product, and how you answered that. There needs to be a test protocol and architecture protocol. In a lot of submissions lately, for me, 510K submissions containing software have been at least 500 pages long, or more in some cases. So software is a significant part of your device application. What is the main criteria to go for 510K for 510Ks for existing products? It's hard to understand what's being asked. Well, the main criteria is go to the guidance document. There are very many guidance documents that are specific for devices. For example, there is a guidance document for electromechanical vessel sealing devices. There are ones for catheters, indwelling catheters. The first thing to look is to go to those guidance documents and see what is required. The second case is to look at devices on the market and look at some of their 510K summaries and see what they had to go through to get that product on the market.
Hi, Sam.
Yeah.
Just a minute, I would like to interrupt you here. So we are actually running out of time, everyone. I would request you to please post your questions in the questions section. We will take all the questions in and we will reply back them over the email. So hi everyone, welcome back. So we will be sharing the recorded version of this webinar with you all, and you can also find our other webinars on our website, which is www.saracasolutions.com, and you can also check the website for the upcoming webinars as well. But unfortunately right now we have to stop the webinar right here, but don't worry folks, we have all your questions with us and we will be answering each and every question shortly. So I would like to thank James for sparing his valuable time from his tight schedule and sharing very important information related to 510K submissions. And I would also like to thank each and every one of you who has attended the webinar by taking out their valuable time. That's all for today. Thanks for joining, everyone.